Sentire Media.
Taci. Sulle soglie del bosco non odo parole che dici umane, ma odo parole più nuove, che parlano gocciole e foglie lontane. Ascolta, piove dalle nuvole sparse, piove sui nostri volti silvani, piove sulle nostre mani nude, sui nostri vestimenti leggeri, sui freschi pensieri che l'anima schiude novella, sulla favola bella che ieri ti illuse, che oggi mi illude. Quiet. At the edge of the wood, I do not hear the human words you speak, but I hear newer words which speak of drops and distant leaves. Listen, it is raining from the sparse clouds, raining on our sylvan faces, raining on our bare hands, on our light clothes, on our fresh thoughts, from a newly opened soul, on the beautiful fairy tale that yesterday misled you, that today misleads me. In the last episode, we followed the life of Italian poet, adventurer and soldier Gabriele D'Annunzio and brought him up to the start of what would be known as l'impresa di Fiume, the endeavor of Fiume. Today we will continue that narrative and see how Gabriele D'Annunzio ended up. Now, the group, this mixed band of army officials, volunteers, there's not many career officials here, but a whole band of volunteers, let's say, make their way towards...
Even trade unionist revolutionaries.
Yeah, various, so as you were saying before, from left to right, a collection of different people that start making their way towards Fiume. Now, Fiume was actually, after the First World War, was occupied by, let's say, official Italian troops whose job should have been to stop this expedition. Indeed, they were stopped once with the threat of being shot at, to which Gabriele very dramatically opens up his jacket, showing his bare chest, and said, if you must shoot me first, which then deters the official, and they allow them to proceed. The sort of thing happens a second time. The official Italian army attempt to stop the expedition. Once again, D'Annunzio shows his chest, this time with his medals, pointing at his medal for bravery, saying, if you must shoot here. And again...
This is marketing.
Well, this is perfect marketing and symbolism. So, saying, shoot here if you must shoot. And again, the official can't bring himself to shoot. This would have been a sort of fratricide, Italians fighting against Italians. So again, they let them proceed. The expedition obviously required logistics and trucks. So an Italian general, sort of dissident general, had actually promised D'Annunzio 20 trucks for the expedition, but when the general showed up, he got cold feet. So it was at that point that D'Annunzio pointed his gun at the head of the general and says, please give me the trucks, and the trucks were duly handed over. So with these troops then swelling, because as D'Annunzio's expedition made its way towards Fiume, Croatian friends, please forgive us because we're not very good at pronouncing the current Croatian name of the city, and in Italian it's known as the Impresa di Fiume. We don't want to take it back anymore, so
no.
We're quite happy
we don't need it.
Without it. We don't need it, so it's just that it's easier for us to say Fiume. So they make it all the way there, and at the time the city had a strong strong presence of Italian population, and they were basically welcomed as liberators.
Yes, because Rijeka, Fiume, was until 1400 was dominated by Venetians. So they spoke Italian and Venetian dialect. And during the march from Ronchi to Fiume, lots of soldiers, Italian soldiers, they met on on the route.
And they joined
the expedition.
Yeah.
That was not cost any life, because nobody was hurt in this
in the initial expedition.
March,
exactly. Yeah.
Because D'Annunzio, the ideas of D'Annunzio, the ideas of D'Annunzio,
the action of D'Annunzio was a man of action.
Every Italian supported him in that particular moment. It was the government, the Italian government, to oppose this idea, because they didn't want to
anger the Allies,
after the World War.
That's an important distinction, Matteo, I think, because the Italian government was forced to oppose D'Annunzio in a certain sense. I mean, if it had been for them, as often in Italian history the Italian government has done, they would have been happy to wait and see how things went. The unification of Italy itself was a case of the Piedmontese government sitting back and waiting to see how the Garibaldini did, and then decide what to do afterwards.
This is typical Italian.
Exactly.
Wait and see. Maybe it's from Machiavelli.
Possibly, yeah. So the government at the time would have been the Nitti government, which had come in after the fall of the Orlando government, which would have been the one who basically left and then went back to the Treaty of Versailles. That government fell. And so then we have the Nitti government, who sends a telegram asking the Italian generals to crush this occupation. But for the moment, nothing really happens. Also because the Italian government didn't really know how far they could trust their own army. I mean, there was absolutely no guarantee that the regular army was willing to fire upon D'Annunzio, because this, as you said, from left to right, this was a very popular endeavor.
It was a very particular period in Italy, and so the army stood still, because there were lots of movement came from the ideas from Moscow, from the October Revolution, from the communist revolution in Russia. This movement have some fallback in Italy, and they feared that in Italy could blow up a sort of a revolutionary movement. And so the army stood still, because they knew that this movement that was moving toward Fiume was built by two different sides of the society, from the left and from the right. And this movement to Fiume could spark a revolution in Italy.
Also in Italy, yeah. The risk was that if the Italian government had immediately opposed the endeavor by force, there was a real risk that the rest of Italy could have risen in rebellion. It was a very unstable time. Indeed, it was.
Workers and soldiers that fought the First World War, you could unite together and fight against the government, the bourgeois government.
Exactly.
And pull it out.
And then it was this great instability that you mentioned, Matteo, which was later exploited by Mussolini, who managed to take power again, in a constant turnaround, flipping from one side to the other, and he finally managed to take power, posing himself as the protector of the bourgeoisie from, this evil Bolshevik influence. And interestingly, actually, that you mentioned sort of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was actually one of the first international countries to recognize Fiume and D'Annunzio's authority over Fiume, which is also quite interesting. And again, another reason why it's difficult to sort of associate or consider D'Annunzio a fascist, because it's not correct to define D'Annunzio a fascist. You cannot place D'Annunzio in a particular political way. Sometimes you can say he's a lefty fascist, anti-bourgeois, elitarian, and decadentist. I don't know. Yeah, big. Indeed, then at this point we can say D'Annunzio and his band or his irregular army find themselves occupying Fiume. And now what do? They need to govern the place. They need to form a government. And in the formation of the government as well, I mean, for example, his foreign minister, so Ronco Cineschi, for example, was a philo-Soviet, he had very strong support for the Soviet Union, for example. So far from fascist position, you could say. Others maybe less. Another prominent member of his government, of his organization, was a man named Guido Keller, who instead looked towards the Orient and the refusal of the capitalist society. You know, already back then we had these movements looking towards the Orient. Indeed, he formed what was known as the yoga movement, because they were interested in sort of Eastern cultures which refused Western social values. So it was a very interesting big mix.
It was like a sort of hippie commune with some Nazi
exactly
in between.
And that's perfect, Matteo, because as I was sort of reading up on the whole business of Fiume, I thought this sounds like a hippie commune, you know?
It is.
And it
indeed.
exactly was. And indeed, you know, the Fiume in that year, more or less, because we're talking about the endeavor starting in September 1919, and then at the end Fiume was taken back, or let's say liberated in a certain sense, by the regular Italian army at the end of 1920, so little more than a year. But in that year, Fiume became a sort of laboratory, a place very far ahead of its time. It's a sort of the city of freedom, sexual freedom, political freedom. Divorce.
Homosexuality not forbidden.
Homosexuality was not forbidden. Total equality between men and women. And who knows, maybe, you know, that could have been one of the reasons why people were so quick to want to repress this whole thing, because it went against
dangerous experiment. It was for the bourgeois.
Absolutely, because it went against almost all of the established values that were there at the time. So.
And the important thing is that they made a sort of constitution for Fiume, which is called the Costituzione del Quarnaro, which maybe nobody knows that a part of this constitution became a sort of a base for the Italian constitution, which came after the World War II, because there was a very intelligent work on primary rights, which were transferred into Italian constitution almost 20 years later. And the Nuncio thought about a sort of a collectivism in the industrial production. And this sort of collectivism in industry was very attractive to the Soviet, which, as you said, recognized the Republic. Yes, a republic.
Exactly. So yeah, we mentioned the Costituzione del Quarnaro. I just wanted to make sure we'd gone over some of the most interesting points. So we said equality between the sexes, possibility of divorce. Just a reminder, I mean, we're talking 1919. Divorce did not become legal in Italy after that until 1974.
We needed a referendum to...
Exactly, with a referendum. So, I mean, way ahead of their times. So equality between the sexes, we said, corporativism, but in a real sense, you know, as we said, workers' rights, not the corporativism that then Mussolini would use to basically squash workers' rights under fascism. And so, you know, peace and love and a free community. And I think at the same time, what comes out of the studies on the year sort of the period of Fiume under D'Annunzio's rule is this maybe sense of that it couldn't last forever. So there was this desperate sense of partying, constant partying, because maybe everybody knew that sooner or later this experiment would
was
end.
A projection of his life. I think D'Annunzio thought about Fiume as a sort of a picture of his life that couldn't last forever. An idealistic view of what life should be, but that couldn't last. He knew it couldn't last.
And indeed, in 1920, the Nitti government falls. Now that's what we do in Italy. Our governments come up and they fall, you know, a couple of times
every year, every couple.
Yeah. Last 20 years or so, they've lasted a bit longer, but they shift around a bit rather than actually falling. So the Nitti government gave way, and once again on the scene comes the old fox of Italian politics, Giolitti, who, although D'Annunzio thought he was an astute and able politician, he now comes up against somebody who actually was an astute and able politician, for good or ill, obviously. So as we say, Giolitti comes along and he manages to outmaneuver D'Annunzio, from an Italian point of view, he pulls off quite a masterpiece of diplomatic magic, which is the Trattato di Rapallo, the Treaty of Rapallo, which between Italy and Yugoslavia, which basically saw Italy get practically everything they wanted, with Fiume becoming a free state, but with the condition that D'Annunzio had to leave Fiume. D'Annunzio refuses. He doesn't accept it because at this point he became convinced of something you mentioned before, that maybe the experiment of Fiume could be exported. He really started to believe that this revolution could be exported to Italy and maybe to the rest of the world, and that time maybe had come to expand these ideas to the rest of the world.
Or maybe he's as a decadent, as a poet, he wanted to be under siege and
it's a great way to go
his own life.
Yeah, as a work of art. Yes, as a work of art.
His death could be a work of art.
Yeah.
And so the act for the act. Try to destroy Fiume. I'm not
budging.
I'm not
moving. I'm not budging. It could have been, yes, just the dramatic flair and the act for itself. So faced
we don't know. This is the fantastic thing about D'Annunzio. We don't know if he did what he did for a sort of ideal convention, or maybe he just wanted to be a part of it.
It was just another play for him.
A wonderful play, because his life
great
has been a very wonderful play.
Exactly. Fiume was put under siege by an Italian general, Caviglia, who actually quite irritated D'Annunzio, because we must remember D'Annunzio is first and foremost a poet, so General Caviglia wrote to him in bad Italian grammar at a certain point, saying chiunque il quale, translate into English something like whoever he who. So from that moment on, when D'Annunzio would talk to or write to Caviglia, he was no longer General Caviglia, but whoever he who, just to sort of make fun of him a little bit more. But in the end, when faced with the bombardment of his palace and his office window by the battleship, the Andrea Doria, was actually shelled D'Annunzio's palace. That's when they gave up. The Italian attack on Fiume saw about 50 victims on both sides, 50 total between both sides, and at least, in a nice gesture at the end of it all, recognizing fratricidal attack, all of the 50 were buried together, so the people inside and outside Fiume buried together, and that was basically the end of D'Annunzio's political career in a certain sense. Then he retired to this beautiful place that Matteo strongly recommends, because one of his favorite places in Italy, the Vittoriale.
In Italy.
So tell us something about the Vittoriale, Matteo.
This is a wonderful villa in the Garda Lake near Salò. Mm-hmm. D'Annunzio retired after the siege of Fiume, and he collected all his memories, all his relics from this endeavor in this villa. He took the prow of the ship that was in the harbor near Fiume, and he took it to his villa, which is now the prow is...
the prow of the ship is stuck in the mountain.
Stuck in the mountain.
Yeah.
Near the villa, and you can find all the uniforms and
his library, his private library with all the books on cars and car components and his own writings.
Relics of war, or the World War One.
Yeah, because we must remember that also during World War One, it was quite an adventure. I mean, his was the famous flight over Vienna.
Yeah, there's the plane in which he flew upon Vienna,
so
throwing
manifestos, out flyers to the Austrians, exactly, asking them to surrender, basically, if I remember.
And he's buried in this villa, and around him there are the tombs of the people, of the most important officials, or
the members of the Endeavour.
Of the Endeavour of Fiume, in a round tomb, very moving, which stands upon the lake. If you see on Google, and D'Annunzio's tomb, you will see his tomb in the middle, and around him you can find the tombs of the people,
of his comrades in arms, in a sense.
His comrades that were buried beside him.
But D'Annunzio didn't die in 1919, or no, sorry, 1920. He didn't die until 1938. And as we were saying at the beginning, he was a bit of an uncomfortable. He was actually in a sort of prisoner situation. Indeed, he was watched very carefully by the fascist police because they didn't really know what to do. Obviously, they couldn't really harm him because this was the national poet. This was the Vivace. This was one of the great symbols that had been at the basis of the fascist ideology. So they couldn't really harm him in any way and take him out of the picture. And you were saying, Matteo, one of his last endeavors was his attempt to convince Mussolini not to enter the pact with Hitler.
Yes, he thought in Verona. He tried in the last public apparition of D'Annunzio. He went to Verona to meet Mussolini that came back from Berlin. He tried to speak him to tell him not to ally with the Germans because he hated Adolf Hitler. He knew that it would be a disaster. But he was the old man. He was out of fuel.
Yes,
he had no more. He was old. He was 71. I mean, destroyed by his life of
excesses and alcohol and drugs and
he had no more appeal on the public.
Yeah, he had
opinion.
no sway on.
He tried this desperate endeavor, but he couldn't succeed. And this is very sad. We have some photos in the internet. If you write D'Annunzio, Verona, Mussolini, you see an old D'Annunzio standing behind Mussolini, very sad, looking at him, and you can think he thought this is over. This is over.
Yes.
The disaster is near.
It is complete. Yes. And who knows if he had lived through the Second World War, or maybe he would have joined the partisans at this point.
I think so.
I think knowing D'Annunzio at this point, he would have been a resistance fighter up in the mountains somewhere. So.
And then there is an interesting backstory that when Mussolini went to Rome, the March on Rome,
1922.
D'Annunzio was offered to be prime minister.
Okay, so they offered the prime ministership to D'Annunzio rather than Mussolini.
Yes, they some Giolitti or maybe some other politician. I don't remember.
I remember, but maybe Facta at the time would have been the prime minister.
I don't know. Should meet him, but then the day was fixed for this meeting. He fall out from the balcony. And he always thought, talking about this episode, he called this flight from the balcony il volo dell'angelo.
Okay, the flight of the angel.
And he couldn't meet the Italian politics to
negotiate the possible prime ministership.
The possible prime minister. And in the history, this episode was classified as a fight between D'Annunzio and one of his lovers that was jealous. But the backstory is that someone
pushed him off of the balcony to avoid.
He risked his life. He took several months to
get better, to recuperate from that.
Il volo dell'angelo. He fell from this balcony in.
So instead of having Benito Mussolini as a prime minister, we could have had Gabriele D'Annunzio, and maybe the fate of Italy would have been very different.
Maybe. No, for sure. Not something worse than Mussolini. Sure.
Yes, it'd be hard to have gone worse. So it could have only gone better, we hope. So I think we've done a good job of covering D'Annunzio and the Impresa di Fiume, the endeavor of Fiume, which then would become part of the fascist legend or the fascist rhetoric, let's say. Although we think we also did a good job of pointing out that Gabriele D'Annunzio himself was not a fascist.
Maybe he should have done more than what he did. He had the power to overthrow the situation. Maybe not to overthrow Mussolini, but to
correct the direction that fascism went.
Let people understand what was happening. He did something, but it was too late.
It was too late and not
like
enough.
We said before in Verona. He was too old. And
too little, too late.
Mussolini was too strong. And the world was going to the tragedy that...
Yeah, something to say maybe about the perceived inevitability of history. Sometimes we see as inevitable things that in reality maybe were not.
No, they were not. They were not something. Someone could have done something to stop this tragedy.
Yeah, which I suppose is also a good message for
what's happening
today. So, we hope you enjoyed our little chat. Remember, as always, if you want to, you can get in touch. hello@ahistoryofitaly.com. At the same URL, ahistoryofitaly.com, you can click through to our social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and on Instagram. And you can also support the show by going to the support page and becoming a Patreon supporter or make a one-time PayPal donation. We thank you very much if you decide to do so. In the next episode of Fascism 100, we'll be exploring the phenomenon of squadrismo, Benito Mussolini's band of armed ruffians. Until then, thanks very much again for listening, and resistete. Resist. Resist. Resist.
Sentire Media.
Hey, podcast producers and show hosts. Do you want to join a podcast network that celebrates all things Italian? At Sentire Media, we understand the allure of Italy and its unique culture. Our devoted team of hosts and producers are all driven by their shared passion for Italy. And we work tirelessly to create the best lifestyle podcasts and content that will whisk you away to the very heart of Italy. With us, you can savor the mouth-watering flavors, get lost in the stories from the past, break down the cultural barriers, and truly immerse yourself in the vibrant traditions of this intoxicating country. If you have a great podcast idea or are already in production and would like to join Sentire Media, head over to sentiremedia.com, that's SENTIRE media.com, and find out how to submit your show.